Hello everyone, today we talk about late medieval and early modern Highland warriors. So I'm quite thrilled because this is actually the first video on my channel about Scottish history specifically, and I personally love Scotland. I was lucky enough to went there on vacations once on a beautiful tour of Scotland by car, so lots of amazing places. Unfortunately not the one I will be mostly discussing it today, that is the Iona Abbey, famously. We'll talk about that later. I also regret not to actually have learned more about Scottish history. Probably those who follow me regularly have noticed that on more than 200 videos now, I've been talking really a few about British history. If not, and when I did especially was about this more specific military history topics rather than general history, but I will get to that as well. I swear. And since most of my audience is actually Anglophone, and you come either most of you are Americans, but there are lots also British viewers. I realize most of you were passionate evidently about medieval history for following such videos. Already know on average much more than me, definitely. So my videos at that point will be something, I can't say introductory, but maybe I will do some broader considerations to just maybe consider the cultural perceptions, maybe that can be more interesting, me myself not coming from an Anglophone country. But anyhow, this was meant, it's my series of military history videos about the Middle Ages, but actually the Highland warriors, and especially the ones that we will be, at least the typology we will be documenting today, is actually to be found also in terms of their specific equipment and all, very late in time. We will see that. So this is roughly about a mid-14th, mid-16th century. So we get into even, in fact, to the modern age. And so, as we were saying before, talking about our Highlanders today, and especially documenting ourselves on these beautiful pictures, these beautiful grave plates, essentially, very detailed ones. You know that in terms of military history of the Middle Ages, some of the most amazing sources are these tombs. Tombs are usually from the early Middle Ages, when European peoples, by some extent, were not still Christianized, or at least they had still a very similar sort of still a lot of pagan influence. They kind of buried the warriors together with their equipment. At a certain point with Christianization that stops, but towards the lower Middle Ages, where material culture gets a bit more florid, we have these beautiful stone sarcophagi that show in great detail, like in this case, such the equipment of the knights. Obviously, these were elite. So it was the only ones who could afford to have this such. First of all, a grave like that. Secondly, their families. I mean, to have the means to actually had even these their past being represented in such a fashion. Here, what is striking about this, we will see it later, is that this equipment remains pretty much unvaried for a long time. We're talking about an elite of West Scotland. These were clan members, clan leaders sometimes. So that's the reason why they were documented. Excuse me, I drink a little before I go on. And what is amazing, in fact, is that such equipment remains virtually invaried over the centuries. So these beautiful graves are to be found in the extraordinarily famous abbacy, or abbey, how you want to call it, of Iona. So This is located on the homonymous island that is just off the Isle of Mull on the west of Scotland, and this is notoriously one of the most famous and important and oldest, as a matter of fact, religious centers in, say, in Western Europe. And this is the Abbey of Iona is most famous because of the foundation of a monastic community by Saint Columban himself, and especially it's fascinating in its geographical location because of the historical developments that occurred in this area. So this was famously between this area, the Sea of Ireland is this area into which was a lot of contact between Ireland and Britain. Actually, these coasts were pretty much Gaelic. There were Gaelic settlers in there. Iona was, as a matter of fact, a spreading point of Christianization of Scotland, in a moment also into which many, in fact, inhabitants of Ireland were pouring into Scotland, so that we have the Scots today that are this that form at this time as an ethnic group mix, say essentially this mix between the Picts and the Gaelic populations of Ireland. So and there are many developments, especially during the early medieval times. This is an extremely fascinating area, because there is a lot of dynamism involved. Think of all the islands that exist in chiefly the Hebrides as the main centers that see the rise of the so-called kingdom of the Isles. So that this existed a bit later as such, between the 9th and 13th century, but it's extremely fascinating because this was a very a very intensely I don't know how to say that, Norse-side. I mean, there was a lot of Norse influence into the whole matter during the Viking Age. There was this extremely fascinating a multicultural blending of Gaelic culture, Norse culture, of influences coming from Britain and all. So it's a very varied, very culturally rich environment that also sees a lot of syncretism with the local military tradition, since this is what today we'll be talking about. Definitely Scotland had a great Norse influence in itself. I mean, the Scottish have always been pretty tough to I mean, for everyone to enter in the hinterland, but you know, people trade, people move, people need to expand, especially by sea, and these islands were essentially an extremely sort of dynamic area. Even the same society was pretty similar to the one of Scandinavia in many ways. This attached also a lot of fluidity and relative instability because of all these clans that were clashing. So there was a few structural base that could, you know, make political domains pretty solid. So there was a lot of warfare going on. These populations were pretty warlike, and they gave origin to a particular military culture, of which still in the late Middle Ages and up to into the modern era, we can still see, in this sense, the legacy, if not the continuation proper. So So the Abbey of Iona, by the way, was sacked even by the Vikings and eventually was rebuilt, I think in the 12th century. So what we see today, it would be essentially, I'm not an expert telling the truth, but I think that is so. And in this place was the burial site of such clan members that evidently had that were chieftains essentially, and they had a great prestige in the area, and a lot of also political influence in here, and the same and could in fact exploit these bonds with. It seems that certain clans, for instance the McKinnon one, had this is mostly speculative, but it seemingly had a lot of ancient relations, even with the same milieu that sowed the foundation of Iona proper in the 6th century. And so we're talking about extremely ancient clans. There is all of a genealogy revolving around these clans of Scotland, West Scotland in this case, that have been that are object of studying, very thorough research. I think even if sources, as you can imagine, are relatively scanty, at least up to a certain point in time. Into these later times, definitely we have sources that we will see even afterwards, in part by quoting certain combat episodes that are described in there, were written down by the stories of these clans were written by the clans themselves. And so we have sometimes it's a bit of a mythical, it's like a bit with the English nobility that at a certain point was keen in telling, kind of tracing back, even maybe by inventing it, that their origins are from the times of William the Conqueror. There is a lot of these Normans or Brittonic or even Flemish sometimes nobility that had joined William the Conqueror. This is typical of lineages of feudal societies, let's say, that need at a certain point to add prestige to their origins by adding up these details in this. But what is fascinating is that in the meanwhile, they tell us a lot also about warfare, which was what these clans were mostly doing most of their existence. As we were said, pretty troublesome areas with a lot of infight and actually pretty large encounters. You might think that, I don't know, Scotland is this. Well, today obviously it belongs to a country that had a very ancient industrialization. I mean, talking about the UK as a whole, and that obviously it's a populated place. But even at the time that you might expect not to have been a particularly, and it wasn't in fact a particularly developed area of Europe, it was still, you still find a lot of warfare going on, even massive armies of several thousands. So we will see afterwards the 1411 Battle of Harlow, for instance. There was an extremely bloody engagement and an extremely ferocious fights were involved that partly were reflected by these, if you want, anachronistic chieftains military culture that still existed in there, and that is reflected also in this kind of gear and equipment. While the essentially these guys were fighting more or less the same way that they fought centuries before, even in full Renaissance warfare. Obviously, this is also a bit of an approximation, as they quickly also adapted to the kind of combat. But there were certain fighting typologies, like the ones depicted in these gravestones, that really seemingly remained unchanged. There might be a lot of artistical, a bit of traditionalism or a bit of artistical license as well involved, but we have no reason to doubt, even from other historical accounts, that these guys actually keep fighting like that, even when there were pikes and arquebuses and all. I know what is the most beautiful thing here is the sword. I know many of you are interested about it. We will extensively talk a little bit about that, even if I'm not extremely expert on, not on weaponry generally, but especially on swords. I can't tell extremely much. So the point here is, I would say, describing these figures. Before passing to swords, maybe let's talk a bit about the general equipment of this of these guys, because as we've said, all these gravestones, not just at Iona, but you can say that from graves, these effigies you can find in every basically West Highland churchyard between the 14th and 16th century, and they all show this virtually identical equipment. So what do we have here? Start from protection from armor. You have a bassinet. So it is quite a enveloping helmet with pointy and closing basically the face, even the whole face in a certain measure. At least it seems from certain pictures, because usually the bassinet is, as most helmets, is also open below. Here it's seemingly, at least from some pictures I've seen here, the kind of a piece of that at least continued below the chin, which happened. It could happen as well. Maybe it was also another kind of gorge, excuse me, throat protection, I don't say that, added, so not part of the helmet proper, also because it would have been difficult even to wear it otherwise. But before I say other stupid things, so this is a bassinet. It's a relatively homogeneous, it's pretty fairly common helmet at this time, like in all the rest of Europe, which is kind of normal, because the first protection ever you want to have on a battlefield, even if movies never show this properly, is protection for your head. I mean, even if you are you can't provide I mean, the first thing you want to defend is your head. So even if you're extremely poor, you have just a very few material like leather and all that's, however, the head is where you want to put it, because if your head is damaged, there are much less chances for you to recover than if you're hit in other parts of the bodies. So the head is always the first protected part. What you see here is also this deep male coif, and that was worn, in fact, to protect the under the bassinet, and so extra protection from the head and this area covering even up to the shoulders, often with this coat of mail. Excuse me, I drink once again. So what is also interesting is the lack, apparently, of other major armor in this, which is not, I mean, obviously you have to think that these equipments were not standard by any mean. I mean, they were probably, why are all these tombstones alike? I mean, showing these effigies actually showing pretty much the same equipment with no armor, as a matter of fact, if not in rare cases. We'll see that later, especially with the grave slab John Maclan of Ardna Murkan, which we have actually two pictures in which we have a full plate armor representation of the man, and another one that instead sticks exactly to this. And this has also a bit of a peculiar trait there, because it is equipped not with these swords, but is with a sort of stock. We will see it later. So we have to think that maybe even in terms of, it might be a cultural thing, right? That these guys wanted to be represented in a more traditional gear that maybe had spread at this point at a very early age. I mean, the bassinet with this Akutan and all, even the kind of sword, is something it's typical actually from the 14th century even. So it's a pretty archaic equipment, and we have to think, also knowing about generally about Scottish armies in the first place, that these West Highlanders joined, that obviously was a big deal. I mean, Scottish armies at a certain point are, yeah, they're a bit more. I can't say backwards. I mean, they have a bit more of a traditionalist and archaic fashion, because these weren't extremely developed areas of Europe. So even certain equipment were short. Even Britain as a whole, telling the truth, wasn't. It had to often import material and means and even soldiers from the continent at this time to keep up with the technological developments that were happening in there. But it was mostly a matter of resources. It's not that these people didn't really have the technology or couldn't afford that. But let's say that Scottish armies were, by the 15th century, were Renaissance armies like the others. So these guys were, even if probably even the environment of West Scotland was peculiar and more a wilder area, etc., that probably also needed, in this sense, a different kind of equipment and molded, shaped, and particular kind of warfare still was perfectly in touch with Renaissance warfare. And most of these guys, obviously, as war professionals, some of the highest war professionals of Europe at this time, were perfectly capable of using them, both arquebuses, and they surely had plate armor, as certain documents prove. But this it's still interesting that they preferred to be represented like this. So with a kilted Akutan, so apparently without armor, because the Akutan can actually be used also over armor. This is something that is often overlooked, especially in the West. In the East it was pretty common. At least when I was telling about Byzantine cataphracts from the 10th century, for instance, they usually wore there was even this sort of gambison that was called in Greek epilorikion, which literally means over the lorica, essentially. So this kilted Akutan could conceal even a sort of armor, so there would be nothing weird about it. But it's just that armor doesn't show much, and in general, we know these Akutans. Akutan is a term, by the way. It's pretty interesting because it comes from the Arab. So Akutan would be the essentially the anglicization of this term that actually had this I think Gaelic equivalent of kotun. So this padded fabric Akutan that comes actually from the Arab kotun, which is cotton. Indeed, even if this was other material, even silk, as we will see now, which makes perfect protection, by the way, was used also in Japan, etc. So it's interesting also that in the local Scottish language, such names coming from even the Mediterranean were perfectly already there. So this tells you how, and they were used in common language to define, especially this military thing. So this tells you, by the way, how military technology was very global already at the time. Military technology, say, doesn't have a nation, doesn't have this. It's as long as it works, it's adapted, it's used all around. The same goes for the Latin term lorica. This it would be the cuirass in a certain sense. That seemingly in the West Highland tongue was called luireach or something like that. I'm sorry for the pronunciation, I don't know. That's my shirt, and it comes from the Latin lorica. So these were actually kind of equipment you could find everywhere. So as we said, these guys were pretty big, say bigwigs in a certain sense. So they had some of the best equipments around, definitely. They could afford them. These were lords owning castles, in this sense, even people, cattle. So there were people they were the elite of the West Highlands, and they could have this very good equipment. In fact, There is a source from 1521 that actually describes the Akutan built in there as a linen garment, manifoldly sewed and painted or daubed with peach. This was done for waterproofing. This is very interesting, and with a covering of deer skin. This is actually pretty cool, especially the pitched thing, because making this Akutan waterproof is pretty, especially, Britain doesn't have a good weather, seemingly. So even these guys, you have to think, obviously they were used to pretty tough. I mean, at the time, considering technology at the time, that were exposed to warfare, just like today, by the way, to extreme tough environmental conditions. They stayed fighting, under this terrible weather sometimes. Well, a lot of humidity involved. By the way, these were also pretty maritime areas, so even humidity, these guys went back and forth with ships from the Isles. They were probably also masters in amphibious operations and stuff like that. So having this waterproof Akutan, so pitched one, for that purpose is very, very, very cool, because they rarely found it elsewhere. But at least I think at least it was common also in other areas. But these Khotun, so as we have called it, could be also made of silk. Silk is an extraordinary material. It's used even for bulletproof armor today, because silk has this, it's extremely resistant. So if you have all these very thickly sewn silk protection, they can really shield off an awful lot of blows and hits. So you have to imagine them to be also very richly embroidered, with I don't know, even the mail could be adorned with gold and gems. By the way, you have to think of these, even of armors and everything like surcoats and Akutans and all, to be extremely colorful. The reason now you don't have to think of the picture of the Middle Ages like a knight to be all, I don't know, grey, or it could be all black, because that was done to avoid the rust in certain cases. The brunette armor was usually black, but for the rest, armor was of all color, beautiful colors, all over. You couldn't see grey most of the time. It was all colored green, yellow, red, blue, and all. It should have been fantastic to see these guys there. There was probably also certain uniformity involved. Think about these Highland warriors. Some of them eventually later were called Red Shanks. Some of them went fighting to a bit like the Galloglass into Ireland. There was a lot of, think about the obviously all the various clanic patterns of Scotland, extremely famous. So even these colors that were sort of a uniform, also to be distinguishing to battle. We'll see later, now that these battles were an extremely messy thing. They were butcheries, and to be honest, and it's one of the few fights in which probably was something closer to a disordered melee that we can see, because these guys had a very individualistic mindset. Obviously they fought into groups as well as all humans, but they could get into this very chaotic melee as well, and fighting more or less individually even. And we'll see this all relatively also to the equipment and how it was functional for this. So what is interesting here, as I was saying before, this sword is the first thing that... by the way, I didn't stop about protection. There could be some other plate armor involved, at least in these effigies in particular, such as couter. So these are plates that guard the elbow, and this would, to get with late medieval technology, they went to become very articulated, In the low Middle Ages could be just, certain normal plates attached to the elbow, more or less anatomically speaking. Then in later times you find these perfectly flexible things, very complex, very well built, and they could also be covered by guard or vambrace, as you want to call it, and also greaves and pollanes existed. So this was maybe on these tombstones. That's what usually the only plate armor involved into the wolfing. For the rest, what you see is the Akutan and the bassinet and mailcough. That's it. So talking now about swords. Before passing to swords, actually, I wanted to make the point about a spear. Most of these guys are equipped with spears, and this doesn't have to be underestimated, as a matter of fact. We see here very big swords, and we will see what kind of they were. These were in medieval times, roughly. They were big swords, but they were usually 1.5 swords. 1.5 hand swords. Only later times, in the very Middle Ages, we have nowadays even double-handed swords, that kind of fit into the. I mean, this should also be obviously double-handed swords start appearing pretty commonly into European warfare since roughly the last decade of the 13th century. Now I am talking just what we can see on these tombstones. So I'm referring to this. I'm not referring to how, what you could find on the battlefield objectively at the time, because surely since the late 13th century these guys already were using double-handed swords in part, but the preferred sword was a 1.5 hand sword, and it was still a larger sword than the usual, as a matter of fact. Swords, we will see it, that actually were pretty light compared to the one might think. These 1.5 hand swords were maybe 1.4 kilos, roughly. 200 swords actually weren't excessively heavy as well. They might even be to 1.8 to 2.6. We have the heaviest double-handed swords arrived at something like 3.5 kilos, no more. Actually, as a matter of fact, I'm convinced that everything that weighted more than 3.5 kilos was never used in combat. We have actually also heavier swords, but at that point we think that they were parade weapons most of all, or maybe they were used by people affected by gigantism. You have to think that this happened historically in history, and there are lots of legends about these enormous warriors. I mean, people that arrived at more than 2 meters in height that could. In this sense, because you have to think indeed that weaponry at this time was all made weaponry. Yeah, there were serious production, but these especially better artifacts were done actually basing on the physical size of the fighter. So these were customized weapons, and of course, if you are affected by gigantism, you're taller than I don't know, than 2 meters. Probably you might have used a sword that was even more heavy. That was even heavier than the canonic 3.5 kilos that you usually find as the heaviest weapons that could be used at the time. But generally speaking, that's an exception, also biologically speaking. So swords never exceeded actually that. Even these beautiful claymore, two-handed claymores. This stereotype of swords that were extremely heavy actually was something into which certain authors and chronicles, including Froissart, as we will see later, would fall. They thought, this was an extremely heavy sword. They weren't, as a matter of fact. It's even with if you train with a normal 1.5 hand swords of, I don't know, 1.3, 1.4 kilos, after a few minutes you're literally exhausted already. It doesn't matter if you're a bodybuilder, if you go to the gym every day, that is gonna destroy you. And plus, it's not just about physical strength, it's mostly about your brain functioning and the technical skills that you can only acquire with lots of training. And this is what these chieftains, these clansmen, did all of their lives. Also because all of their usually short lives were about this butchery, because this was not even warfare. Let's be honest, it will be butchery, but we'll see it later with the sources. I'm kidding, of course. It was an extremely sophisticated warfare as well. By the way, what is interesting is that these guys were also equipped with other weapons, and I mean bows, for instance. Another prominent weapon that appears every once in a while in these tombstones is the double-handed axe. This is very interesting because axes are something you find in Scotland as a distinctive weapon since a very early age, since the times of the early Middle Ages. The Picts, the Scots already used such weapons and were apparently very common. And that's how even the Scots, by the way, you know that at the beginning of the 14th century, Scotland is one of those countries in Europe in which there is this development of infantry tactics, were mostly used against cavalry. So the first weapon was the pike, but behind the pikemen, within them, their ranks as well, there were certain troops with blunt weapons. And every people had a bit of their own. The Flemish had the Godendag's, the Swiss had the Vogue. Well, the Scots had the double-handed axe. This sort of Danish axe, essentially in shape, but it's actually predating Viking times in Scotland. So, also to say that different weapons actually can develop in different areas at the same time. And you understand that even this development of 1.5 hand swords and double-handed swords eventually, and these double-handed axes are meant to have this extremely strong, blunt, traumatic weapon, essentially, that could actually pierce through mail. We will see that these swords could easily cut, easily, I mean, not easily maybe, but with a good blow they could really cut through the mail, flesh and bone even. So these horrendous wounds that could be caused by that. And indeed, at the time, even if you take the Viking era, the double-handed axe was essentially the only thing that with enough strength and the right angle could break through mail. Pretty, at least they were conceived like that. They were pretty also useful at breaking in splitting into half horses' skulls. Like, by the way, the Bayeux Tapestry also pretty much shows in the case of the Anglo-Danish army at Hastings. So you see that those weapons were pretty much around even into England historically, but that happened chiefly because of also of Danish, of Norse influence as well in England. But going on, there is a certain characteristic of these swords. I don't know whether to pass through them directly. Yes, actually we can. I think we can. So, talking about these swords, there was all you have to think during the Middle Ages, the swords had this, culturally speaking, it had a huge significance. This is something that was attributed both by pagan beliefs, and that were eventually cited also by the Christian ones. The sword is the symbol of a cross, for instance, but it's really it was something much deeper, much older. I mean, the idea that the sword basically had a sort of soul on its own that was twinned with one of the warrior. There was all magics involved into this. I mean, all the especially in the early Middle Ages, there was all these beliefs that the swords were magic, especially those who were forged in an extremely peculiar way with material that also arrived from faraway lands, was pretty resistant. This is something you find even in prehistory. You know, the first metals that could be found were the one from meteorites that actually were there because mining technology was pretty poor, so people used these things that were this material that was coming from the sky, evidently, because they had literally fallen from the skies. Then eventually, but still, this idea that the forging moment was a sort of sacred moment, into which certain songs were sung that with very deep religious meanings that, by the way, were also rhythmed according to the rhythm that took to forge the sword. So it was everything that permeated, culturally speaking. The sword was a symbol of the warrior. We're talking about Britain. Think about Excalibur. Think about the Arthurian cycle and all these things, and all the ancient traditions, the Sarmatians influences. These peoples of the steppes who had a very advanced metallurgy at the time were sent into Roman Britain as auxiliaries to fight, and they had these mounds with stones stuck into these mounds, and that's seemingly where the Excalibur Legion actually originates. So you have to think of this broader dimension, and in this area of Britain that we can legitimately call the Celtic fringe, so where actually these Celtic communities had lived essentially at the margins of, we can't say of Europe at this point. The Anglo-Saxons had migrated into Britain, into the most productive area of Britain, the lowlands, parts of the Midlands. So what you have is that the Celts are being pushed, or these Romanized Brittonic and Celtic populations be pushed, in this case westwards, and actually the area of Scotland always remained kind of detached from this. I mean, they managed to have their own autonomy for a very long time. Then, as we know, eventually England invaded Scotland, were the wars of Scottish independence and all, but say that these areas were a bit sort of an isolated ecosystem in many ways. I mean, they weren't isolated at all. They traded, they knew, they went fighting on the continent. You find Irish commanders at this time in the 14th century, even into Italy, for instance. We know that there were German blades that were imported to Britain, and these Scottish swords seemingly have this extremely similarity with Passau and Solingen blades. So we think those have been analyzed and probably were imported to Scotland and eventually mounted with the hills and all, with the local craftsmen and all. But it's the key for understanding the local warfare is society, politics and society at the same time. So these were clans in a relatively poor area. This was a still very sort of, if you have been in Scotland, you know that you have these beautiful landscapes, a lot of water, a lot of mountains, a lot of and a lot of castles that dot the country in these strategic locations that controlled all the various territories, all the various passages, the fordings, the rivers and all, and as it was a bit actually in the rest of Europe, but this area remained a bit more on its own. So this kind of warfare remained pretty attached to this ancient, even sort of clanic, in fact, and military tradition that put a huge deal of emphasis on the single chieftain. So the chieftain obviously didn't go to battle alone. Historically speaking, this idea of the heroic warfare, like you can find in Homeric Greece, or even into Celtic Europe, okay, like in this case, was a bit of an ideal. Like that even these chieftains, so with the best equipments that went forth and all, were always surrounded by retinues. So lighter troops usually, so they belong to, I mean, there were probably higher, equally armored troops coming from the same clan, from the household, and then all, however, these other levies from the local communities that equipped themselves as they could. As we said, it was a pretty poor materially poor world, so even the broader equipment is not that much, and we can suspect that in this sense also the lack of plate armor in these tombstones is not just an archaism or a traditionalism, but in part it has to do also with the fact that these communities could afford very few of such of heavier armor, especially plate armor as it was developing in later Middle Ages and into early modern Europe. Then eventually firearms evolved, and plate armor is rendered useless. Well, the Scots didn't pose even themselves a problem. They simply didn't adopt plate armor in the meanwhile. They earned something about that. I think I'm pretty sure in Britain at least there are certain stereotypes concerning the Scots being tight-fisted or something like that. So well, that's a joke. But it probably stems also from the fact that they were having less resources. They had to make economy relatively to that. But what I wanted to get to is that warfare in this sense was influenced also by this generally lack of armor in part, and lack of other things as well. If you think about eventually the revolts against the English, they in later times, I mean, you still find these Highlanders who were attacking it with their dirks and these blades and all against English muskets. So that is something that evidently is very important to consider. You know, this was pretty there had been a relative evolution of war, say, at least of military technology in here. Although, as we have seen, the elite could afford still the best equipment, but only that probably. So, and the and don't get me wrong, these guys were pretty effective. I mean, if you take even during the 30 Years' War, especially from the Catholic side of the Habsburgs, there were lots of Scottish and Irish men fighting in there. They were extremely prized, even as, in fact, as melee troops. Even in an age into which firearms were taking over, essentially, these guys were still pretty effective, and they could be used as shock troops. They were firstly courageous up to fanaticism. They were raised in this sense in environments that had got them used to even great physical exertions. They were pretty tough, physically speaking, as well. There was a lot of selection, evidently, in that kind of continuous and ongoing warfare that characterized this clanic world of Celtic world of the British Islands. So aside from this, the sword, this is the important, what it was, the sword, it was conceived as a symbol, as the same essence of the warrior, and a status symbol, definitely. Not just because of the cost of the weapon, but that is virtually insignificant in front of the cost of the training, because everyone can get a weapon maybe by killing an enemy, or robbing it, or stealing it, or something like that. But one thing is to be able to use that sword. Such swords require a lifetime of training. And for having such training, it means that you have to spend energies, you have to spend time, and someone has to provide that for you. So only a chieftain that has people working for him on the land and can put those resources for him to train can really train for these weapons. So and if properly used, such weapons were devastating. Now we will see that in description of combat. So there is a panegyric written by one of the lords of the Isles in the second half of the 15th century. So we are in the very late Middle Ages, and it says this. This is taken from the book of Clan Ranald. And there was on the noble side of that powerful man a sword which was sharp, serviceable, long, very hard, sound, straight, of smooth surface, long-bladed, and of equal power throughout its full length. This is important. Now, I'm not an expert in swords physics more than much, but at least this fact that the long blade was of equal power throughout its full length is important, because usually, I mean, every sword by definition, let's say, physically speaking, has one kind of point of balance. So that's the point where basically the blade hits, and it has the greatest effect, cutting effect. And especially in these double hand, say on longer swords like 1.5 and hand and double hand, usually the balance point is shifted towards the hilt. It's the migration era swords, so usually have the balance point shifted towards the tip. That were also mostly, in fact, cavalry weapons. But aside from this, this is interesting because it implies that these even the technology involved in creating these blades was something pretty advanced, pretty serious, and had to achieve such thing. Because sometimes we remain in awe when we see these swords and we say, oh my god, these medieval smiths were amazing. They could do things that with their own technology that not even with our own technology today we can do. This is actually true. I mean, today our steel is, the steel used at that time doesn't even fit in terms of engineering in today's categories of steel. So we have an extremely, their technology is ridiculous compared to ours. But these guys were advanced to us in one thing. It was empiric, but we can't do it anymore. Not even with our technology today. That is giving this point the correct balancement. To make them perfectly ergonomic, which means that it's not just about the quality of the blade, it's really the balance and how this sword actually functions into combat. Well, those guys knew how to make it. Today we don't know it anymore. And it's even partly a mystery how these swords were actually created, especially for the early Middle Ages. We have a very few scanning evidence. We have more or less, of course, we have several informations, chiefly from how these blades were made. Physically speaking, we can observe, but it was partly a lot of wisdom that was acquired even through generations of these myths that had all certain particular ways, and they weren't standard. Every craftsman had its own secrets in a way. But was it what we should also think while saying, wow, these guys could make this, is that also this was still an artisan production in a certain way. So yeah, there were these amazing blades that we can't see, they were perfect, but maybe for that blade there were other 10 blades that had turn out like that. You have to think of that too. So these guys weren't Superman, okay? They knew how to do their job, but still the technology they had produced also a lot of B-series blades as well during the creation process, and only the best ones were praised so much. And in fact, they were thought in this sense to be sort of individuals even on their own, to have their own soul, because a sword it was a unique piece in itself, and there was this relation that obviously we can't understand. There was a bit the same relation that existed between the warrior and its horse and its sword. That was something that went beyond even, I don't know, the family ties or something like that, because the guy had to trust both his sword and his horse into combat. So it was about his own life. So there are beautiful representations of such swords that had seemingly, the Scottish sword in this sense had a very particular hilt. There is a characteristic hilt of the Highland sword that is this kind of lobated pommel, sort of even with a teardrop shape, kind of. I don't know if it's teardrop, let's say a drop shape. It kind of reminds certain Viking era pommels, and the pommel was very, very important, especially in for 1.5 hand swords, because basically that's what you used with the other hand. I mean, one hand was obviously tightening the grip. The other one could help direction in it from the pommel. So that's why the pommels, especially even from the 14th century, they start acquiring this more ergonomic shape for fitting into the other hand's palm, and eventually they evolve into the double-handed swords that still had enough size in the hilt for both hands, but it still could had these pommels that could be sized depending on during the fencing how. You have to think of these, especially double-handed swords, was extremely dynamic fencing techniques. Fortunately, from this time onwards, late Middle Ages, we start having even manuals, fencing manuals, finally, and we can't. If you have ever read one of them, you know how complex and dynamic the use of such swords actually was. And another characteristic is this sharply downward angled quillion. So the quillion is also crossguard essentially, and these short tongues or langets. The langets would be in some swords at least an extension of the guard. That is located on both flats of the blade, and it's designed basically to fit tightly. Also over the mount of a scabbard to prevent accidental unsheathing. So all this, and you can recognize it's even the quatrefoil. I don't know what you call that, quatrefoil, I don't know. Is also a typical feature that it's typical of Scottish. These Highlander swords, and it can be seen also in the Great Seal of John Balliol, King of Scots. So it was a distinctive feature. Sometimes that helps a lot of also in archaeology and to know, well, okay, that came from the Highlands. And what is interesting is that these swords have actually been in use up to very, very late in time into battlefield. So not as dual weapons, but as actually combat real warfare weapons. Seemingly, we have evidence of that even up to the Battle of Killiecrankie, the one of Bonnie Dundee. I have to tell the story about him. Extraordinary figure. in 1689. This seemingly happened. I'm not really sure, but this is believed, at least because certain swords of these were found in the battlefield. I believe. Not sure, but that would be the evidence for such a late employment of such weaponry. So, and we have many evidence of this sword of the Isles, by the way, because this kingdom of the Isles was something that remained floating around, even if at this point the kingdom of Scotland had actually absorbed it in a certain fashion. There were still, obviously, there was still continuity with the rulers that were in there, and there was still a lot of warfare going on between the northeastern Scottish and the lords of the Isles. We relatively to this, the what were really these swords conceived like? Well, these were practically bone breakers. Let's be fair about this. These weapons are conceived essentially to have a traumatic impact. So, longer swords, especially two-handed, double-handed swords, start to appear into Western warfare, as we were saying before, from the last decade of the 13th century. So part of the actually the main reason where this seems, has happened is actually the progress of coat of plates. So these were weapons that, first of all, were conceived in fact to smash and to basically to have this extreme traumatic force over even the joints of the coat of plates. At that time, coat of plates was not still full plate armor. It was just these plates appearing here and there over the mail. So the only reason why this happens is even with coat of plates, because otherwise, the mail was there even before. There were, as we've seen, double-handed axes that were used to carry it, to break mail, practically, in this very physical engagement, especially in this northern European world where the most advanced technologies were starting. Actually, mail had always been there, in some measure, but there was say more iron involved into the lower Middle Ages than previous times, and still these societies still fighting these very warlike heads of especially single fighters, theoretically, because formation combat was still, however, the main thing. However, to something very physical, so something that really had to go there to smash the adversary's armor and to break it. And so even this big physical show-off, telling the truth. And there are probably the best figure of this sword, this representation of this swords that were still well, as we were saying, double-handed swords were. Excuse me, I was thinking. I got mixed up. I wanted to finish. The double-handed swords, however, from this specific West Highland context, starts to be documented only from the later Middle Ages as the average weapon. So before you had this just one hand or 1.5 hand swords. Okay, we have beautiful examples of this all over these. Of these tombstones, and probably one of the best ones is the one from Donald Gillespie, I believe it's called. Excuse me if my pronunciation is not correct. And it's a bit of the iconic picture in here of all these various. It was some of the best preserved. So this guy actually was killed. Excuse me. That was one of the best thing. First of all, I want to say, excuse me, I'm messing really everything up now. I want to say relative to the spear. I think I began before and I didn't end. These guys are depicted also using a spear and a shield. I don't know why I missed this. So the first thing you see with them is the extremely fascinating picture. A spear and a shield, and a small shield. Relatively small. It's like a buckler, but it's actually triangular in form. Now this is pretty normal actually at the time, because the smaller in Western warfare, because with the spreading of plate armor, shields kind of lose of importance, and they kind of get smaller in size. During the 13th century, you basically have already passed from this large kite shield, long especially kite shield, into this small triangular thing. It was more dynamic and all. This is because of the weighting of the armor. I also made a video about that relatively to the Ferraris Guild of St. George, seal of the Guild of St. George. What is fascinating here is that this extra heavy armor doesn't seem to have been out there. The problem with this, as I was saying before, armor actually could be worn even here under the Akutan, even, but it was still essentially, we don't see a lot of plate armor involved, but we still see these small shields and a spear. What can this mean? Well, to me, it's mostly speculative, but since we have this amazing, striking, similar series of equipments in all these gravestones for such a long time, I think it actually suggests an extremely dynamic and agile requirement for agile fighting, especially on the Highlands with such a tough terrain. You need probably these guys still relied on very heavily, say on hit and run tactics at the most, very dynamic combat. Surely there were lots of major engagements, sort of pitched battles, and solid formations involved. So the full need of this not hit and run, but just smashing against each other and chopping off everyone until the last one is standing. But you have to think that most warfare is naturally not on pitched battles, so most of the engagements would occur into these bands scattered around the Highlands, as we were saying, very tough terrain. Now, having a small shield, very small shield, also light equipment overall, so with very scarce amount of armor, and a spear combined, actually suggests an extremely dynamic fencing, based on very agile movements. If you see, most of these guys actually are not even wearing greaves, so their legs are also naked, essentially. Most of what you see also in Irish and Welsh warfare of this time, still in modern ages, is so some of these guys fought even barefooted. Probably it's not the case of the wealthiest West Highland chieftains, but I mean, this relation with nature, even this very wild ground environment and all, doesn't have to be underestimated. I mean, for us it would be a torture to fight barefooted, but you have to think that after some time, your feet actually get used to this small wounds in terrain. You have a callosity forming under the plant of your feet, and you can't easily go. And that's how nature made us, because nature made us essentially as hunter-gatherers. So we're theoretically, we haven't changed genetically from those moments, because we speeded up in civilization pretty much to get past our evolutionary, our biological genetical characteristics, but that was feasible. So we don't have, yeah, we're still, it still requires to be a pretty tough person to do that, honestly, but this was possible. So this was surely the case of, if none of these guys that actually wear certain even boots and other shoes, and but definitely from their retinues, their clanic, let's say the tribal levies, surely were barefooted as well. So what's the sword about? Well, the sword is, now we will get into detail about actually the sword combat. But the sword into this actually is obviously a secondary weapon. You might say, but how? This was major weapon, how was it secondary? Well, it practically really was. And the first weapon in here was the spear. Why so? Because the sword is freaking heavy. You can't fight with a sword like that, especially just for so big, just for 2 or 3 minutes, and that's already too long, because after that you're exhausted. You don't have to think it. I think every person who does reenactment, or at least knows anything about military history in the first place, knows that every kind of combat that happens among humans doesn't last more than a few minutes. It doesn't. Then you have to retreat and recover and restore, because your body can't make it. Especially with such big weapons, you can be trained all you like, but first of all you're using that, plus you've got some kind of still the Akutan and the bassinet and the coif and certain vambraces and greaves. You don't have to think they don't weigh anything. They add up. You have got adrenaline pumping into your system. Your overly your heart is cardiovascular system is pumping blood like hell. You get exhausted in at 3 minutes you're already done, really. And obviously, of course, human resistance can endure incredible things, but you have to think that this was rationalized also for a functional combat, because if you get stressed too much, yeah, you can even fight for 15 minutes, but then you can't move for the whole day, maybe for the next 2 weeks. So you need these combats to last, because they usually lasted for hours. So you need necessarily, if you wanted to continue to fight on along the day, no more than a couple of minutes fighting and then retreating and going on. So in the meanwhile, however, and that was done with this sword usually. But even in here, I think it was too tiring, and that spear that appears in these Iona effigies and all the other ones of West Scotland is pretty meaningful, because that was the first weapon. And what is interesting, it's a spear, because the spear is essentially meant to keep the enemy at distance. They can't close in with a spear. That's the most dangerous thing you may want to do. It's sure these guys had their own faithful dirks. So the dirk is this typical Highlander long thrusting dagger that is one of the most distinctive things. It was also used pretty much eventually also on naval warfare for boarding and all. There's a naval dirk as well, but these guys use it. This is kind of normal. In the Middle Ages, everyone had this kind of side dagger, especially from the 13th century, especially when cut of plate starts to appear. That was very important, because you could stick it into the joints of the plate armor. It was actually pretty effective weapon. The same longsword evolves probably not just for breaking. The sword it kind of gets longer, not just for that smashing power over the structure of the joints, but also for piercing into the joints of plate armor. So there is a functional evolution that happens on various plans. But the idea that the spear was this first weapon you find also in the hand of these guys on the grave stones, and while the sword is always on the hilt, it's always on the side. actually suggests that the spear also had a big deal of importance, and especially with such a few armor on, that kind of makes sense, because the spear keeps the enemy on the distance. It doesn't make it close in, and closing in for someone who is not adequately armored, with which an Akutan, doesn't matter how refined it is, how good quality it is, you're definitely not. That kind of makes sense. Then you wanted to pass at the sword when things started to got rough, or at least when you wanted to show off, when you wanted to duel with someone in melee, or when you wanted to attack someone who had an armor instead, which with a spear, you can't. It's not that easy. And at this point, the Scottish Highlanders, actually fought also against other heavily armored opponents. The English were, on average, obviously the Kingdom of England, in spite of being, let's say, a bit backwards in this late medieval and early modern times compared to continental armies, it still was extremely advanced for the Celtic fringe standards. And this is actually important because we know we'll see now that there were Scots getting against the English armies and with these double-handed weapons and kind of to butcher down everything that was in the way. So these were very, very important. This combination with small shield and spear is very, very, very important, because that tells you it's the primary weapon. And by the way, the spear can also be thrown. I mean, I'm pretty sure those spears could be simply thrown also at the enemy, like every spear in every military context, basically. And I don't want to add something stupid, because these kind of mechanicistic speculations are always difficult to do, but in a place that is called the Highlands, it's going to be pretty frequent for you to be on a higher ground sometimes, even during ambushes and all. So throwing a spear actually from a height is also something that could be exploited well on such tough and uneven terrain, uneven ground like the one of the Highlands. So that also made kind of sense. After all, in Scotland always had, since think about the times of the Romans, this kind of guerrilla tactics as well, that always made it very difficult to invade the place in the first place. So this even this spear remaining up to the modern age, it actually, I think, is a relic of that kind of warfare that was evidently fitting also the combat of this same very elite of the Scottish of the Highlander clans. And this is interesting because usually, the skirmishing thing is usually lighter troops do, and definitely compared to the Western knights standards, these guys, for being the very elite of the Highlands, were definitely lighter than the average Westerner counterpart. So this kind of lighter equipment was also compensated probably by a more dynamic fight into which the spear is something pretty rare, relatively rare, at least, especially in those forms. Probably suggests that because it adds even this missile potential to the guys. By the way, I already told you, these guys also are documented to have been equipped with bows as well. So these guys, first about the 360-degree professionalism of these guys. I mean, they could use every kind of weapon. Double-handed swords, one-hand or one-and-a-half-hand swords, daggers, bows, spears, javelins. I mean, this is what you have to think really the elite was. So also pretty versatile troops, tactically speaking. And we have to imagine them to be involved in every kind of, even of raiding and assault to all these Scottish fortresses that, that were also relatively smaller sometimes compared to the other bigger, think about this time it was the Traces Italiennes developing in the continent. This was, these guys were, let's say, in their archaic world, even with castles that could be climbed, whose walls could be climbed, and these assaults. So the even the physical dimension of the individual fighter was definitely still exalted in such an environment. So the physical prowess and courage and all. So the there is a very interesting quote from the Chronicles of Frasers that tells us actually how a single guy, I think it was on the this was on a bridge on the River Ness. This was happening in actually in when Donald, Lord of the Isles, was in those campaigns for essentially securing the earldom of Ross, that eventually gave culminated into the Battle of Harlow in 1411. So we know a couple of and there is a beautiful gravestone actually from the same from guys who fought at that and died at Battle of Harlow, including one of Gilbert of Greenlow. This is actually not at Iona, but in the Kinkell Kirk in Aberdeenshire. This is one of the most beautiful examples of especially that's interesting for the distinctive Highlanders hilt of the Highlander swords, and these guys fought actually at Battle of Harlow. But before the Battle of Harlow, Donald, Lord of the Isles, was attacking the burg of Inverness. And at this point, his advance of his forces was halted at the River Ness, but a single man was armed with one of these two-handed swords. So the quote is very interesting because it says, John Cumming, a gentleman burgher in the town, on his armour and head-piece and two-handed sword, made such stout resistance at this nearest end of the bridge against the MacDonalds, and if there were 10 more like him in Inverness, neither bridge nor burg would have been burned. This is actually pretty cool because we're talking about a single man, a gentleman burgher from Inverness, who basically stood in front of the whole MacDonald clan with fencing them off with this double-handed sword. And here it says if there had been just 10 people there kept in the same way defending that bridge, the MacDonalds would have not made way through and ravaged the burg of Inverness. This is very, very, very interesting. Here it talks about armor and headpiece and two-handed sword. So we don't know actually what this armor is about. Probably, as we said before, this kind of they weren't all just with this Akutan and stuff. Probably it was coat of mails and even plate armor involved, especially if you wanted to fence off individually a single clan. You wanted to be better protected. Then this guy obviously was taken down in the end, but just think about the potential of this fighter with such a weapon. This is very, very, very interesting. What else do I want to say? Well, whatever. This was it. So I think also the dramatic context to which these things were happening. We have other evidence from the Montgomery manuscripts. Here it says, relative to these Scottish swords, I don't know from the source from which time it is. If it is from the 15th century, but I think it's a bit later. I wouldn't like. I can check. Let's see. Montgomery manuscripts. Actually, it's pretty late. Yes, these are from the 17th century apparently, as I suspected. So this says, oh well, yeah, because this is the history of the Montgomerys. Of course, this was written later. Okay, so at the time, the writer was essentially saying the old people. So this one was thinking about actually pretty older Montgomerys. So it says the old people used no other, for these words could cut through a sleeve of mail and break the arm bone. As we were saying before, so these were weapons conceived actually to cut pretty deep, smashing through mail, cutting even the bone under the flesh. Hello again. As you probably understood, there was some technical difficulties going on, so I had to change microphone. I don't know, my old mic abandoned me after all these videos. Let's spend a moment remembering it for all what we have been hearing together through it. And but maybe I will be able to fix it. Now I have this, and I'm sorry, probably you hear some noise in the background, and it's not the best recording mean I have, but I hope you hear me and that everything goes well. So nothing will stop us. We will go anyway on. So I was about to say a very light topic, telling you the truth, that is how to cut with one of these Highlanders swords through mail, flesh, and bone, and I was adding the fact that actually this was because I've been recording like for 1 minute without realizing that the mic had gone, and I was adding actually that medicine in ancient and medieval times really sucked for our standards, but actually for orthopedy was, telling the truth, something very, very advanced at the time, because it's a very mechanic thing. So while the rest of medicine was basically screwed up by the fact that everything got infected, by the way, also such wounds, so maybe even this works, orthopedy, obviously went wasted because the guy died of infection anyway. Orthopedy was quite advanced, okay, pretty effective. So we have pretty evidence. Just a couple of months ago, I was actually looking at a discovery. I think it was in 12th century Sweden, to which we have seen basically a wound of a guy who actually survived a pretty tough hit on the bone that had been almost cut off, and with certain nails, nails and plaques. So just like with modern orthopedy is really about, this bone has stuck together, and basically the guy's arm was saved. Probably he didn't do a big deal with that, because in certain occasions, also in today's orthopedy, it's better actually to cut off, to amputate directly, because otherwise you're gonna have this arm on, but that it basically has a lot of vascular problems. It doesn't work. Nerves have gone. That's another problem actually. So sometimes it was better to cut it off. Actually, we have pretty extensive evidence, even in medieval history, of people of warriors, of fighters, that when they were cut off an arm. This was found one in Italy recently at the Lombard times, to which a hook or another blade, say arm, was mounted on, so that this guy could fight and work with it anyway. So these swords were capable of such ferocious, damage to be delivered through them, and it could really go in such a fashion. So actually, the point I wanted to make, I had arrived, to this point. We already talked about the German blades that were imported from Scotland. So German blades were imported into Scotland from Germany. In fact, Britain had this major trade actually with Flanders and the Rhine Valley. through the Rhine mouth, and therefore some of these blades that you find even in England itself were also used in Scotland, and these characteristic Scottish hilt eventually were mounted on them, and all. This is pretty simple. So, relatively to the weight of these swords, we have said that Froissart in his chronicles writes that in the especially Froissart is a great source for the 100 Years' War, and he talks extensively about warfare, even if probably he wasn't that expert on certain issues, and he actually states a combat in 1377 where Sir James Douglas, nicknamed the Grim, basically fought the English with a sword that scarcely another could have lifted it from the ground, but he found no difficulty in handling it and gave such terrible strokes that all on whom they fell were struck to the ground. Now, Froissart here is given a bit of a medical idea of the weight of such swords. How could nobody could even lift this thing? Actually, as we have said, this was probably still a 1.5 hand sword, okay? Because that was pretty much the standard at the time. There was someone obviously with double hands the sword, but it wasn't so often like it would happen into the late times. By the way, one of the reasons of this was actually the nature of, well, let's stick to what Froissart says, because basically these words actually weighted, in fact, 1.5 and kilos, so something very, very, and the blades, actually the blades were, if you look at the whole overall weight, you find that these blades were alone, so without the hilt and grip, something ranging even from 60 to 80 grams, so not even 1 kilo practically, and this was pretty, I mean, maybe 70, or even well, it could vary from 60 to 90 grams at the blade single. So not very, very heavy. So why did eventually these swords, even in the Scottish Highlands, seem to get heavier and longer over time, so to become double-handed swords and to exist more frequently in this context? Well, this has to do with the nature of Renaissance warfare. It was mostly about pike warfare, pike and shot. So basically the pikes at this point were a prominent feature of pitched battles, not only, but I mean these thickly packed and disciplined masses of pikemen start appearing into Scottish as well as in English armies. So it's something that goes out there, and that's perfectly fine. So in this context, there were still certain knights that certain soldiers, how you want to call them, the idea of the knight at this point, especially in the Renaissance, is, yeah, there were knights, and there was a very strong chivalric culture still, which is something that shouldn't be forgotten in this sense. But there were also a lot of soldiers of fortune of various sorts, and one of the tasks, especially of these, the guys who wanted to get paid more and having a better reward for their military needs, was to being to these forlorn hope units that were equipped with double-handed swords and basically threw themselves into the midst of pikes and trying to literally to cut through those. And creating these gaps were very difficult, seriously dangerous for the unity of the formation, and it eventually could be exploited by other assault troops to pour in and do other extensive damage. So this starts probably happening in Scottish warfare as well, even in West Highlands, and because that was the preeminent tactical way of dealing with such formations. And This is important because there are certain things you can or can't do with double-handed swords. One of the things you can't do, for instance, is to use this on horseback, while with a 1.5 hand sword you can fight it on horseback. Still, kind of, the best is a one-hand sword, actually. For horseback, you can't use shields. Or at least you can use them and maybe attach them to your arm or to your back, but in this sense they don't have the same versatility and mobility like you want to do. And this is important because we've seen that in this West Highlands milieu, seemingly that equated also to a less. I mean, this started happening into Western Europe as a regular tactics against pikes, also because most of the troops who carried out that task were equipped in full plate armor. So we have seen also the Scots, obviously, had full plate armor was something much rarer, and the fact that we see all these troops equipped with such light armor, even in later times, with double-handed swords, is kind of remarkable, because this means that these guys used it. I mean, they threw themselves into the melee without even a very solid armor on, and this wasn't maybe a great concern for them. But considering that firearms were developing increasingly, well, firearms is what essentially they rendered in a few time basically almost all armor useless. And eventually, into the beginning of the 18th century, they were completely abandoned, if not for this theory, because they were too costly. So maybe commanders could wear them, but eventually. So these guys were exposed even to fire. Scotland began using arquebuses as well as any other place in Europe. So it's still all the more meaningful that these chieftains still relied on their attacking, say, skills and going to the melee, in this sense exploiting fast attacks that couldn't leave time for these guys to even figure out what was going on. Actually, this is probably a mechanicistic explanation. Actually, these chieftains kept fighting pretty harshly against each other, so that also makes sense, because these dual mindset. I mean, the idea that you have to fight one versus one in this clanic warfare. So maybe chieftain against chieftain is was the kind of a great glory of those minds. So even fighting with less armor in these very heavy and deadly weapons was something pretty now. We will see that it's something that emphasized the courage of these people. So this was about the weight, and we also covered part of the Renaissance warfare. And let's pass. So to look a bit more at these kind of fights with two-handed swords. I say double-handed now. It was actually two-handed swords, or double-handed is the grip. So forgive my English ignorance. Oh, better. No, that sounded better. Forgive my ignorance in English. That sounds better. So, but I kind of made the point anyway, because I proved I suck at English. But anyhow. So this island two-handed swords are kind of iconic in many ways. It's been also a bit misused. Relatively to the Montgomery manuscripts, I forgot to say that there is a description actually of a very early fight with these, actually not two-handed swords, but still long swords that, in this sense, I mean, were, however, still iconic in the warfare, in local warfare, since a very long time. There is the writer of the Montgomery manuscript describes the shearing sword of William Wallace, who decapitated, according to him, I think all of you know William Wallace from Braveheart. Knows it. That's a beautiful movie, but has a very few, say, historic, especially into combat. It is not extremely accurate. It's not actually not at all, but it's a beautiful movie. And when I kind of renders the idea, it's one of the few movies, for instance, in which you see actually cavalry charging in line. The first battle, if I'm not wrong, it is one of the few things, but for the rest, it's complete and utter rubbish. But I always say, do not look at movies to say, oh, that's wrong, that's historically incorrect, and to act like with this sense of superiority. Braveheart is, a matter of fact, a beautiful movie. So always my advice is to consider, to appreciate movies for their artistical value, not how historically correct they are. Because surprise, surprise, every single movie is historically inaccurate. Doesn't matter whether one thing is more accurate than another. War is one thing. Movies are fiction. Point. Even if they look good or if they look plausible or whatever. But this Montgomery manuscript states William and in William Wallace. In Braveheart's William Wallace, you see this guy with a double-handed sword. As a matter of fact, that time, double-handed swords exist. There is also William Wallace sword somewhere in England that I remember were in one of these beautiful collections, because British people are pretty keen on these things. They collect swords. There is all a very florid market out there. But there is this word that is attributed to William Wallace, and seemingly was just a much later thing, built up, by the way, not even for combat. It's actually a huge sword, I think even extra weighty, and actually made up of, also pretty poorly from a mechanical point of view, two parts probably stuck together, which was also how certain swords were made. But that's a fiction. That's not William Wallace's sword. And he in all likelihood, probably used a 1.5 sword rather than a two-handed sword. But anyhow, we have this later, much later modern source that, however, states with pride that William Wallace decapitated an English soldier, even though his neck was protected by a layer of mail, essentially. And the head of this guy was cleaved through to the collarbone. And this was probably not a two-handed sword. So think about how even two-handed swords later could really, or already at the time, but later more massively, more massively widespread, how they could be actually extremely effective and could create these horrendous wounds and cutting people in, limbs and heads. And without armor, I think it would have not been extremely difficult even to cut a person in half. But it required at least a lot of strength and a lot of the right angle, which is difficult to do where you're on a battlefield. But generally speaking, we have this archetypical Highland two-handed sword. We've seen it with Quatre-Foy Quillon, which is not actually a claymore. Claymore, it's a very famous sword but this is not actually the real type. It was existing at the time. It's a different thing compared. Claymores are this also were pretty long swords. They began, I think, to appear from the 15th century. Or even earlier, actually, and I think all I know actually is possibly correct me. Please correct me about this. But I know that there is this problem of terminology. Actually, that claymores are, every two-handed Scottish sword can seem to be a claymore. Actually, it is not seemingly so. I still don't know what the difference really is, but seemingly this is. But I know even the term is used pretty interchangeably, at least in popular culture, so I don't really know what I'm talking about. Claymore is simply a the anglicization of a Gaelic term, which means big sword. So even the scientificity of the categories on which we talk about these weapons is kind of a, considering especially, as we said, these were all artisanal products in many ways. So we have another account from an event. This is taken from the history of the Mackenzie family. Talking about an event, this was written at the beginning of the 18th century. So these are all later sources that basically at the time these clients were writing for their own, looking at their own more or less historical past. And naturally we have to think these guys, especially at the time, had more knowledge in certain ways that we do about their past things. But so we can't take these accounts literally, not because they're implausible, and in fact I'm thinking they're still pretty good, but because you have to imagine these were stories aimed at aggrandizing especially the warrior qualities of their ancestors. That definitely were warriors, but maybe of that kind, definitely, but maybe this or that event is a bit made up, or at least there were certain exaggerations. In spite of all, I think they still fit pretty plausibly into the historical background of the time, even if they are stories that were written several centuries afterwards. So, in the Mackenzie history, there is this fight in Ross in 1501. And there is this military band led by Actor Roy Mackenzie of Gairloch. So you have to think, even their military organization was based on these bands. That it was kind of normal at the time in Western warfare. I mean, we are at this time, the modern state is about to be formed in the way at least we mean it canonically. And the big deal of that was to create a standing army. So these were very early times telling the truth, especially into Britain. That the situation was a bit even to start in certain measure. But this is also relative. But say for most centuries, all the military organization was based a bit like it had started from the Low Middle Ages. So basically, these bands of mercenaries, actually, there were knights or lords, how you want to call them, with a retinue, who sold their services to the best offer. And in the case of this, Celtic fringe, this went all a bit along with still tribal, clanic warfare against these clans, and still going to fight abroad. Before, in fact, I was saying there were plenty of Scottish and Irish troops in France, in Germany, who, in fact, came from these poor areas of Europe to search for fortune on the continent, and were quite praised for military quality on the continent that was wealthier but softer, a little bit at least on average. So this Mackenzie band defeated, by the way, a much larger force commanded by Sir William Munro of Fullis, I believe, Fullis. So basically, this is what was told. What was the fate of Munro's men that had been defeated by the Mackenzie? So, I quote, most of Actor's men being armed with axes and two-handed swords, they cut off in that little space so many heads as tumbling down to the well. There were counted 19 heads in it, whence to this day it is named Tober nan Sean. Now this is a Gaelic name that would be, or the fountain of heads. So this, it's kind of brutal. It doesn't. It's more of the psychological effect, the reason why I quoted this. But let's say that here, no, actually, it actually explicitates. It says with axes and two-handed swords, they cut off these guys' heads and threw them in a well. So a bit nice, bit of nicer early modern times on how to deal with defeated enemies. So the interesting fact is, by the way, the Mackenzie and the Monroe actually fought even side by side on other occasions. So think also about all the political relations that existed between these clans, the complexity of the whole relations, also together with the everything was happening into the Kingdom of Scotland, into the Kingdom of England, in Ireland, and so on. So what I mean is that there was a pretty homogeneous way of fighting among these Highlanders, and a pretty common military experiences. This is what I meant. There is what else can we talk about here? The Battle of Flodden. Now, the Battle of Flodden is one of the most important engagements of the time. It was fought in 1513. This was actually an English victory. The actual, we have an account about Scottish. There was fought between, obviously, against the Scots. I mean, I say obviously as the English and Scotsmen were always kind of being there on their own. It was actually a pretty big English victory. Okay, and you see that from this battle, there were also. It's famous also because James IV, King of Scotland, was killed, and there were lots of other troops guided by the main Scottish families. Think about, and there were several earls of Scottish earls were killed into action as well. The one of Montrose, the one of Bothwell, the one of Lennox, the one of Argyll, some of the most actually prominent noblemen, which tells you, by the way, how these guys were able to be involved. I mean, they were normally involved in such bloody engagements also in person. It was actually also a matter of pride to fight and die in such major engagements. So basically, the center, by looking at Scottish performance, the center with James IV was defeated. The left actually was also defeated by the English right, but they were at least able to retreat in some good fashion. The only success the Scots gained on that line was actually on the right, and there is a quote from Pitt Scotti Historia 270, which states, "The Earl of Huntly's Highland men, who with their bows and two-handed swords rode so manfully that they defeated the Englishmen without any slaughter on their side." Now, this is kind of exaggeration, but it still tells us some very important things. First of all, as we've said before, the use of bows. Bows, actually, the tradition of longbowmen, the longbow was at this time present as well as among the English, albeit slowly declining. At least in the first half of the 16th century, the English still an extensive use of longbows. But eventually they kind of needed to modernize, at least to compete with the other major continental powers. The Scots remain probably pretty attached to this weapon as well. So bow and two-handed swords, which seems a deadly combination. So this is essentially combined arms, because the bow is good at attack as well as in defense. You can soften up an information, either that you want to assault or that is going to assault you. And then you have these ferocious two-handed swordsmen who are actually most of all an aggressive. Tactically speaking, they're this thing that really obtains more results on a good assault, raging assault. Also, if in defense, that can still work. Two-handed swords, as we were saying before, have a pretty dynamic fencing. You can use them pretty good to parry as well. They are essentially these metal bars that you can use in many ways. And it's interesting that this combination on the right was effectively successful against the Englishmen. Then I don't remember now in particular the details of the Battle of Flodden, but maybe we'll get to that in one of our videos. So maybe we'll try to understand better. And I'm sure some of you are pretty keen on it, so maybe you can just comment and say it. Okay, there is another evidence that got me curious, and I was hinting at it before. That is the gravestone of John Maclan of Artna Murchan, or Murcan. I don't know how you spell that, how you pronounce that. What is interesting about this is that basically shows actually two warriors. One is equipped with full plate armor, and another with this typical bassinet, coif, Akutan. And now these two figures can actually represent John Maclan as well. The same guy wearing different armor. This is very, very interesting because here the difference actually between the most up-to-date equipment and the traditional one of the Scots is pretty it's pretty evident. And it is beautiful because probably this was kind of a ideological thing. Here the guy, the clan wanted to stress the fact that even though this guy had modernized in equipment so that he could wear such heavy armor, they however still were fighting on in their traditional fashion as well. And what is even more curious in this sense is actually the weapon that is being used by the figure with the let's say the archaic equipment, which is something pretty. It looks like it's not one of these swords that we've seen. It looks more like a stock. It's basically a bar, very thin and long bar of iron that is actually is seen elsewhere in European warfare, starting appearing at this time, essentially for the purpose actually of sticking this bar into the joints of plate armors. So that's also where why early modern, early modern swords were actually evolving towards that form. But this is actually like a stock. It's not even a sword proper, apparently. And it's kind of interesting because it's a kind of saying, okay, yeah, look at this guy that is still less armored, doesn't have the full plate armor, etc. But it still has this weapon that is pretty effective. as a stock against full plate armor. So it's a sort of revenge, I don't know how to say that, against plate armor. A little bit, like saying we're still dangerous. Yeah, we might not be wearing full plate armor all the time, but still we can attack it and aggress. And actually, it's plenty of evidence during this era of lighter troops that were not actually scared to attack full armored opponents with these weapons, trying to stick them in the few vulnerable parts that were left uncovered. This is very interesting because the full plate armor guy, yeah, it still can move pretty decently in armor, but it's still more, clumsy than a guy that has a lighter equipment. So this basically means that if you are sometimes even in armor, you can jump at this guy and so closing in, so this guy cannot use his sword at a long range, etc. And you can start trying stabbing continuously him with these weapons, and this was a pretty effective way to make it. Actually, if you look, I made a video about the Janissaries recently, exactly about this time in contemporary times, 15th, 16th century. We're talking about that that were equipped especially also with blunt weapons, and this kind of makes sense because most of the Janissaries were actually unarmored. Sometimes they had to meet these armored opponents like these clans and the think about in the Balkans, there were full plate armor being used in there as well, especially both from Milanese production, armor production and all. And so it's kind of interesting. You always find in as long as there is an armored opponent, some lighter guy with kind of nasty weapons can stalk at the guys at closer range, which is something extremely risky, because you have to be able to reach the enemy in the first place. But once it's done, you have theoretically have an edge on him because of the aforementioned reasons. So what else can we say? So we can quote another thing. This is instead from always the Chronicles of Frasers that we quoted also before. And this is actually a from an event that an event that occurred in 1544. When the Frasers and the MacDonalds of Clan Ranald met on the shores of Loch Lochy. So I just quote, "There followed a hot engagement, fought more like lions than men. With slashes and strokes, their arms two-handed swords and Danish axes, front to front, forcing upon each other so fierce and forward that they seemed to fell one another like trees falling in a wood, cutting and consuming down each other till some room at last was made." Space. Such as bow armor, headpieces, and coats of mail knocked down their opposites without resistance like tender twigs of shrubs, till at last they came to close combating and fighting hand to fist. Hardly was any found without his mate and marrow to encounter him. Many were seen to fall, none found to flee. All fought for victory. Space. At length, in their heat and fury, they ran two into the loch, grappling like wrestlers, and stabbed one another with their dirks. Now, this is fantastic, actually. This is actually the best quote of all, because it tells us essentially about an encounter, the first half of the 16th century, between two Scottish clans, two Highlanders clans. So the first thing, it's I mean the whole story basically revolves around the fact that these guys were essentially facing one another straight away, one against one, everyone searching his own enemy individually. Naturally, we can imagine it also a bit like we were saying before, not as a fully singular duel that was a bit the myth of chivalric Europe. I mean, this fact that it was single combat against single fighter against single fighter, like in a duel. Actually, humans fighting formations, and even though probably you don't have to throw away, especially in this relatively I can't say indisciplined in a negative thing, but I mean in a world that still was fighting among tribes, essentially, not with a state that could have a discipline, etc. That an individual could really go out there without discipline into the mist just to show off, to prove how tough he was. And the interesting thing here is that, first of all, a metaphor that recalls me also other metaphors I've read into the medieval warfare, the fact of the trees, like the fact that we're cutting and consuming down each other. So imagine this guy is probably being also pretty tough, tall, strong, young males that were practically big in size and cutting down each other. Now this fact that we're cutting down each other is perfect if we consider the equipment they had. So just the Akutan, that some defense is able to provide, but up to a certain point. But these two-handed swords and Danish axes, here it says it clearly. So these massive weapons were designed essentially with a single blow to cause massive damage on a person's body. So maybe these guys, as we've seen, might have worn plate armor as well, but seemingly probably most of them wouldn't. Even though we must say, even if you look at the Wars of the Roses in England, you see that it was pretty big amount of armored opponents at that time, because it was actually same clansmen, in that case the English noblemen. But I mean, there is this parallelism between, in fact, this kind of warfare, because that was mostly sort of dynastic clash, you know. So it didn't involve the wall. It just these regiments were usually noblemen were pretty heavily armored. So probably, but in the West Highlands maybe this was a bit less true, as we have seen. So lighter people, so people that were literally cutting each other into half with such weapons. Now think at the violence. Now we're telling this. Now I'm comfortably sitting on a chair in my home. With it cold outside and pretty warm in here. Think about, what the hell, cutting a person in two pieces. I mean, I can't even understand about cutting a person in two pieces, but the problem is that you might risk to be cut to pieces yourself. Now, this is pretty. Think about the mindset of these people. Tough like rock, So the Well, it take guts also just to go under the mitraille or being shot at distance. I'm not saying that these guys were particularly, but think about the individualistic ethos that stands behind such things. As we've seen, these guys were cutting themselves to pieces. Now, to train an arquebusier or a pikeman, it takes a lot of resources, but individually it's because they are large formations. Individually, they're not great fighters, okay? Just have to work in formation. These guys, as we've seen since an early age, were trained intensively and extensively in every kind of weapon with a great dispendium of energies and all. So these were investments. They costed a lot. They were elite. And in these clashes, such elite was literally cut down to pieces. So it was pretty serious business. To arrive at that point, it means, think about the hatred that existed between these clans, how violent and fierce and ferocious they were against each other. So extremely violent engagements correspond also partly to these extremely violent attitudes and mentalities that are, whose fighters are fueled with, indeed. This is another beautiful detail, such as boar armor head pieces, and I don't know whether this is actually head pieces. Actually, probably they're parts of armor. I don't think actually the head, because it says such as boar armor, head pieces, and coats of mail. But I don't know, it could really be actually, yeah, because it says knock down their opposites without resistance like tender twigs of shrubs. So here there is a bit of a contrast between the strengthness of the armor and the weapons and the softness even of the human body in some measure at least. Think about the traumas that could arise even through a cut of plate with such weapons at you. And what is interesting, and they came to close combating and fighting hand to fist. So this is part of the dynamic fencing we were talking about before, something actually very very dynamic, into which, by the way, you can be the best disciplined soldier in the world, but you're still a human being, and if you are under excessive pressure, you're basically gonna forget at a certain moment in combat of all discipline and training and all. You're just smashing your rifle in the head of someone with like an ape, which you are, by the way, because humans are. So even this thing, coming hand to fist, it's like, think about the hatred, the insane lust for blood at this point, and wanting really to kill the person in front of you. It doesn't even matter to use anything. It's just even with fists. So that's why I think very very dramatic context in here. And they all had someone to fight with, and I think here, if I read correctly, basically they it says that they were grappling like wrestlers and stabbed one another with their dirks. So this is what we were saying before. Even if these guys wore armor, these dirks were perfect at close range in that wrestling combat fashion we were talking about before, to stick and to stab the enemy in the joints of the armor. But probably some of these guys didn't wear full body armor at all. And there is the same chronicle actually goes on stating that basically even the wounded that were lying on the ground kept swinging their swords at the legs of the enemy clansmen. So think of the thing. Maybe these guys were being cut. I mean, they were amputated, stuff like that. With the other arms, they kept swinging and trying to chop off an enemy leg or something like that. And we have seen here that greaves, yes, there were, but they were also pretty rare. So chopping. I mean, at least from iconography, then iconography is a little bit different from reality, but as we've said, materially poor world, a few armor, and so we have to imagine pieces of people actually spread all around after such engagements. There is evidence of other weapons used, like targes. We have sources as late as the 17th century, even from these tombstones, actually showing claymores still being used, and so we have to think that was a prominent weapon in the Highland warfare that somehow remained, as we have seen, for a very long time ahead. Okay, so what else can we say? I think this is over. It's been overly long. And I'm sorry for the technical problems now. I'm working to solve them in the future, and for now we'll try to take some noise in the background away and You tell me what you think. I hope also to get a better microphone, because the one I had was terribly cool. Maybe I will be able to repair that. I'm sorry for today. I had this problem with it, okay? But nevertheless, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming videos. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.